June's hands were bound with rope so tight her wrists bled, and her brother's voice cold as the Montana winter echoed across the cattle yard. "She's 7 months gone, but she's strong. Worth a rifle and $20. The men circled her like wolves. She didn't scream, didn't beg. But when the wagon jolted forward, something inside her snapped, not fear, but fury. She kicked, twisted, and ran into the blizzard, whispering to her unborn child, "They'll never sell you too." Before we begin, if you love stories of survival, redemption, and second chances, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The cattle yard stank of manure and desperation. June stood in the center with her hands tied behind her back, breath coming in short bursts. The men didn't look at her face. They looked at her belly. "She got a name?" one asked. "June," her brother said. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. "But names don't matter much when you can't pay your debts." June's throat closed. 3 years ago when Mama died and left them the ranch, he'd held her hand at the graveside and promised, "I'll take care of us. You'll never be alone." Promises rotted faster than wood in Montana winters. The ranch failed within 18 months. Debts piled up like snow against a fence, and somewhere between the bank notices and the empty whiskey bottles, the brother who'd cried in her arms became a stranger who saw her as $15 and a rifle. "You expecting poetry?" he'd said 2 nights ago when she'd begged him not to do this. "You're a mouth I can't feed carrying another mouth I sure as hell didn't ask for. This is business." Now he was conducting that business. "I'll give you $10, a man in a torn coat said. "15 in a box of shells," another countered. Her brother grinned. "Now we're getting somewhere." June's legs shook. Not from fear she'd burned through fear yesterday, but from hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The baby kicked inside her insistent, a reminder that she wasn't the only one whose life was being bartered away. "Let me check her teeth," the second man said, stepping closer. Her brother grabbed her jaw and forced her mouth open. June tasted copper in rage. She bit down hard. "Jesus!" Her brother jerked back, blood dripping from his thumb. He raised his hand to strike her. "Hold on," the second man said, laughing. "She's got spirit. That's worth something." Her brother lowered his hand, but his eyes promised violence later. "She's strong, good for work, won't complain." "Won't complain." June spat blood into the snow. "You'd know all about what I won't do, wouldn't you, Charlie? Like how I won't ever forgive you for this." Charlie's face hardened. "You'll forgive me when you're not starving in a ditch somewhere. I'm doing you a favor." "A favor?" June laughed, bitter and sharp. "Is that what you tell yourself when you're counting your blood money?" One of the men whistled low. "She talks pretty for someone in her position." "She won't talk much once I get her home," the second man said. "I'll give you $20 and a Winchester rifle. But I want her loaded now. I got a 3-day ride and I'm losing daylight." Charlie nodded fast. Too fast. Like he was afraid one of them might change their minds. "Deal. Help yourself." The man with the rifle moved toward June. She stepped back, but Charlie shoved her forward. "Get in the wagon." "No." "June." "I said no." Charlie grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the wagon. June dug her heels in, but the snow gave her no purchase. He lifted her. She was small, too small from weeks of not eating, and threw her into the wagon bed like a sack of grain. Pain exploded through her side where she hit the wooden planks. For a second she couldn't breathe. Then the baby kicked hard and angry, and June gasped air back into her lungs. The man climbed into the driver's seat and took up the reins. Charlie stepped back, already pocketing the money. June looked at him one last time. "When this baby's born, I'm going to tell her about you, about what you did, and she'll know what kind of man her uncle really is." Charlie's face twitched. For half a second, June saw something flicker there. Regret, maybe. Or shame. Then it was gone. "Suit yourself," he said, and turned away. The wagon lurched forward. June's heart slammed against her ribs. She twisted her hands behind her back, feeling for any give in the rope. It was tight, but not impossible. The man had tied it fast, but not well. She worked her wrists back and forth, ignoring the burn as the fibers dug into her skin. The wagon hit a rut, and she bounced hard. The rope loosened a fraction. She kept working it. The man was humming to himself some tune June didn't recognize. He didn't look back, didn't check on his cargo. He'd already decided what she was worth, and it wasn't much. That was going to be his mistake. The trees grew thicker as they moved away from the cattle yard. The road narrowed into barely more than a trail. Snow began to fall again, thick and fast, cutting visibility to a few yards. June felt the rope slip another inch. Her wrists were slick with blood now, but she didn't stop. She pulled hard, felt the burn turn to fire, and then the rope fell away. Her hands were free. She looked up. The man still wasn't watching. He'd pulled his coat tighter and was hunched forward against the wind, focused on keeping the horses steady on the icy trail. June took one breath. 2. Then she jumped. She hit the snow and the world exploded into white and cold and pain. Her shoulder took the worst of it, slamming into frozen ground that felt like iron. She rolled once, twice, and came up gasping. Behind her, the man shouted, "Hey, get back here!" June ran. Her legs were weak, shaking from hunger and cold, but adrenaline drove her forward. She crashed into the trees, branches tearing at her face and hair. Behind her, she heard the crack of a whip, heard the man cursing, heard hoofbeats. But the trees were close together here. The wagon couldn't follow. She ran deeper, her boots sinking into snow that came up to her knees. Her lungs burned. Her vision started to blur at the edges. She pressed one hand to her belly and whispered, "Hold on. Just hold on." The sounds behind her faded. No more shouting. No more horses. Just wind and her own ragged breathing. June stumbled over a root hidden beneath the snow and went down hard. Her hands sank into the frozen ground. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't hold. She rolled onto her side, curling around her belly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The cold was everywhere now, in her bones, in her blood. She closed her eyes and thought about Mama, about the ranch before everything went wrong, about Charlie when he was still her brother, and not a man who'd sell his own family for a gun. She thought about the baby, about whether it was a girl or a boy, about what name she would have given it if they'd had a chance. Her breathing slowed. The world went quiet. And then she heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. June tried to lift her head but couldn't. She braced herself. Maybe it was the man from the wagon. Maybe it was wolves. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The footsteps stopped. A hand rough with calluses but surprisingly gentle touched her shoulder. "Easy now." The voice was deep, worn down by years and weather. "You're half frozen." June forced her eyes open. Through the blur she saw a face. Bearded, scarred. Eyes that looked like they'd already buried everything they'd ever cared about. But the hand on her shoulder didn't pull away. "Can you walk?" June tried. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. She shook her head. The man sighed long and heavy. "Course not." He bent and scooped her into his arms. June wanted to protest, wanted to say she could manage, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she let her head fall against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Don't die on me," he muttered. "I'm not in the mood for digging graves in frozen ground." June's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I'll try not to." "You do that." He carried her through the trees. June drifted in and out. At some point the trees opened up and she saw a cabin. Small, sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney. The man kicked the door open and brought her inside. Heat hit her like a fist. June gasped, her whole body shaking violently as it tried to adjust. He set her in a chair by the fire and wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders. "Don't move." He disappeared into the back of the cabin. June sat there shaking, staring at the flames. The cabin was bare. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner. Everything clean and orderly in a way that spoke of a man who had too much time and nothing to fill it with. The man returned with a tin cup and a bowl. He pressed the cup into her hands. "Drink." June drank. The water was cold and clear and burned all the way down. She set the cup on her lap and looked at him properly for the first time. He was older than she'd thought. 40 maybe. Hard to tell with the beard and the scars. His eyes were gray and flat like stones at the bottom of a winter river. His hands were scarred too. Burns, she realized. Old ones. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He crouched by the fire and added another log. "Because dying out there would have been a waste of good snow." June blinked. "That's your reason?" He glanced at her. "You expecting poetry?" "No, just honesty." "That is honest." He stood and handed her the bowl, stew thick and steaming. "Eat, you're too thin." June took the bowl and ate slowly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. The man watched her for a moment, then turned and walked to the corner of the cabin. He picked up something June hadn't noticed before. A cradle. Small. Hand-carved. Beautiful in its simplicity. He set it by the fire without a word. June stared at it. Her throat went tight. "You have a child." His jaw clenched. "Had." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. "I'm sorry," June said quietly. He didn't respond, just stared at the cradle with those flat, dead eyes. Then he turned and walked to the door. "Get some rest. I'll be outside." The door closed behind him, and June was alone. She finished the stew, set the bowl aside, and pulled the blanket tighter. The baby kicked. Strong. Steady. "We're safe," she whispered. "For now." Outside, wind howled through the trees, but inside the fire crackled, and June let herself close her eyes. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. Thomas stood on the porch staring into the dark. Snow had started again, falling soft and silent. He used to love nights like this. Used to sit right here with Mary holding Emma, listening to her laugh at the way snowflakes caught in his beard. Now the silence was suffocating. He didn't know why he'd brought the girl back. Didn't know why he'd dug out Emma's cradle. After the fire, he'd sworn he'd never let anyone into this cabin again. That he'd live alone, die alone, and let the whole damn world forget him. But when he'd seen her in the snow, beaten, bleeding, pregnant, but still fighting something in him, cracked. He recognized that look. The refusal to quit even when quitting made sense. Mary had that look when the fever took her. Emma had it when the smoke filled her lungs and she couldn't find the door. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to care. Didn't want to feel anything except the familiar weight of grief. But the girl was inside now, and he couldn't throw her back out. Not yet. He turned to go back inside, and his boot knocked against something on the porch. A small wooden box he'd shoved under the bench years ago and forgotten about. He picked it up, brushed off the snow. Inside was Mary's journal, the one she'd kept in those final months before the fire. He hadn't been able to open it since, hadn't wanted to read her words and remember what he'd lost. But now his hands moved on their own. He opened to the last entry. Mary's handwriting neat and careful. "Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I know you, you're blaming yourself. Don't. What happened wasn't your fault. It was an accident. A terrible, heartbreaking accident. That boy who came here last week, the one who knocked over the lantern in the barn, he was just a child. 14 years old and scared out of his mind. He didn't mean for the fire to spread. He didn't know the wind would carry it to the house. He came back 3 times after begging to see you, begging for forgiveness, but you wouldn't see him. You were too deep in your grief. I need you to promise me something, Thomas. Promise me you'll forgive him, not for his sake, for yours. Because holding on to that anger will kill you just as surely as the fire killed me. His name was Charlie. Charlie Morrison. He had a sister. Said her name was June. Please, Thomas. Let it go. I love you. Always. Mary. The journal slipped from Thomas's hands. It hit the porch with a soft thud. Charlie Morrison. The name burned in his memory like a brand. The boy who'd come to his barn that night 5 years ago, desperate and hungry, begging for work. Thomas had been in town. Mary had let the boy sleep in the barn, given him food. The boy had knocked over a lantern. The barn caught fire. The wind carried embers to the house. Mary and Emma died in the smoke before Thomas could get them out. He'd never seen the boy's face. By the time Thomas got home, the boy was long gone. All Thomas knew was a name, Charlie Morrison, and a rage so deep it had hollowed him out from the inside. Now that rage crashed back over him like a wave. June. Charlie's sister. Thomas walked back inside. The girl June was asleep by the fire, her face soft in the firelight. She looked young, innocent, nothing like her brother. But she was his blood. Thomas stood there, fists clenched, staring at her. Every instinct screamed at him to wake her up, to tell her who he was, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain her brother had caused. But then the baby kicked. He saw it, a small movement beneath the blanket. A life that had nothing to do with the fire. Nothing to do with Charlie Morrison's mistakes. Thomas closed his eyes and took a long, shaking breath. Mary's words echoed in his head. Promise me you'll forgive him. Not for his sake, for yours. He couldn't forgive. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he could make a choice. He could throw June out and let the cold finish what her brother started. Let her die the way Mary and Emma died, alone and afraid. Or he could let her stay. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at the cradle, at the name carved into the wood. Emma. His daughter would have been 9 years old now. Old enough to help her mother in the kitchen. Old enough to laugh at his terrible jokes. If she were here, what would she want him to do? Thomas knew the answer. He'd always known. He picked up the blanket that had fallen from June's shoulders and tucked it back around her. She stirred, but didn't wake. You can stay, he said quietly. For now. Then he turned and walked back outside, leaving the door open just a crack so the heat wouldn't escape. The snow kept falling. The wind kept howling. And somewhere deep inside Thomas Hale, something that had been frozen for 5 years, began very slowly to thaw. June woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body screaming. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin was still warm. She pushed the blanket aside and stood testing her legs. They held. Barely. She walked to the window and looked out. Thomas was in the yard shirtless, despite the cold, swinging the axe with brutal precision. Each strike hit exactly where he wanted it. No wasted movement, no hesitation. His back was a mess of scars. Burns, she realized. Old and deep, covering most of his shoulders and spine. June turned away, guilt twisting in her chest. This man had lost everything. And now she was here, eating his food, using his daughter's cradle, taking up space in a life that clearly had no room for anyone else. She had no right to be here. But the baby kicked again, hard enough to make her wince, and June steadied herself against the table. She had no right. But she had no choice. The door opened, and Thomas walked in, sweat dripping despite the cold. He glanced at her. You're up. I am. He nodded and moved to the fire, adding wood from the stack by the door. You need to eat. I need to leave. Thomas paused, then looked at her. You got somewhere to go. June hesitated. No. Then sit down. She didn't move. I can't stay here. You don't want me here. Thomas straightened. His eyes were hard, unreadable. I don't take in strays, and I don't make a habit of charity. But I also don't throw out pregnant women to freeze to death. So sit down and eat, or I'll tie you to that chair and make you. June's eyes widened. You wouldn't. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Try me. June sat. Thomas handed her a plate, bread, cheese, dried venison, and June ate in silence. When she finished, she looked up at him. The cradle, she said. Your daughter's... Thomas's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. I saw the name, June continued softly. Emma. That's beautiful. Don't. I cry for mine too. June said, one hand on her belly. And she's not even born yet. I cry because I don't know if I can keep her safe. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Thomas closed his eyes. His hands clenched on the edge of the table. You want to know what happened to Emma? His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. She died because I wasn't here. She died because some fool kid knocked over a lantern in my barn, and I was too far away to stop it. She died because I failed her. June's breath caught. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Thomas opened his eyes. They were red-rimmed hollow. I left them alone. I went to town for supplies, and I left them alone, and they died. You couldn't have known. I should have known. The words came out like a roar. Thomas slammed his fist on the table and June flinched. I should have been there. That's what fathers do. They protect their families. And I failed. The silence that followed was deafening. Then quietly June said, My brother sold me for a rifle and $20. Thomas looked at her. The man who raised me. June continued, her voice steady now. The man who promised to take care of me. He looked me in the eye and sold me like livestock. So I understand what it feels like to be failed by the people who were supposed to protect you. She stood, walked to the cradle, and placed her hand on the smooth wood. But I also understand that sometimes survival means accepting help from people who have every reason to say no. So thank you, Thomas Hale. Thank you for keeping the fire burning long enough for me to find it. Thomas didn't respond. He just stared at her, something shifting behind those gray eyes. Finally, he said, Your brother's name, what is it? June frowned. Charlie Morrison. Why? Thomas's face went very still. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. June stood there confused and suddenly afraid. What had she said? What had she done wrong? Outside, she heard the axe start up again. Harder this time, faster, like a man trying to outrun his own demons. June sank into the chair and pressed both hands to her belly. I don't know what just happened, she whispered. But I think we just made things a whole lot more complicated. The baby kicked in response. And in the yard, Thomas Hale swung his axe again and again, trying to bury the truth that had just crashed down on him like an avalanche. The girl he'd saved, the girl carrying new life in his dead daughter's cradle, was the sister of the boy who'd killed his family. And now Thomas had to decide, would he let the past consume him, or would he let it go? The axe hit the wood with a crack that echoed through the clearing. Thomas split another log, then another, his breath coming in harsh clouds. Sweat froze on his skin, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop, because if he stopped, he'd have to think. And if he thought, he'd have to face what he'd just learned. Charlie Morrison's sister was sleeping in his cabin. The boy who'd killed his family had a sister, and Thomas had just saved her life. He brought the axe down again, harder. The log split clean through, and both halves flew in opposite directions. Thomas didn't pick them up. He just grabbed another log, set it on the stump, and swung. Mary's words kept circling in his head like vultures. Promise me you'll forgive him. Not for his sake, for yours. I can't, Thomas said out loud. His voice was raw. I can't, Mary. You don't know what you're asking. But she did know. That was the hell of it. Mary had always seen through him, seen past his anger to the man underneath who was drowning in grief and didn't know how to swim back to shore. The cabin door opened behind him. Thomas didn't turn around. You've been out here for 2 hours, June said quietly. You're going to hurt yourself. I'm fine. You're bleeding. Thomas looked down. His hands were torn up blisters, broken open and bleeding into the wood grain of the axe handle. He hadn't even felt it. Go back inside, he said. Not until you tell me what I did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. Then why did you storm out like I'd just told you the devil was my uncle? Thomas's grip tightened on the axe. Because maybe I needed some air. For 2 hours, in the freezing cold, while you're bleeding. June stepped closer. She was wrapped in the wool blanket, her face pale but determined. I'm not stupid, Thomas. The second I said my brother's name, you looked like I'd shot you. So either you tell me why, or I leave right now, and you never have to see me again. Thomas finally turned to face her. You can't leave. You'll die out there. Then tell me what's going on. He stared at her for a long moment. Part of him wanted to tell her everything. To watch her face when she realized what her brother had done. To make her carry even a fraction of the guilt that had been crushing him for 5 years. But another part, the part that sounded suspiciously like Mary said, she's not her brother. She's just a girl who needs help. Your brother, Thomas said slowly. 5 years ago. Did he ever mention being in Montana? Near a ranch up in the timberline? June frowned. Charlie wandered a lot after Mama died. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, come back drunk or hungry or both. Why? Did he ever mention a fire? June's frown deepened. No. What fire? Thomas looked at her. Really looked at her. Searching for any sign of deception, any hint that she knew what Charlie had done and was playing innocent. But all he saw was confusion. Never mind, he said finally. Forget I asked. Thomas, I said forget it. He turned back to the woodpile. Go inside before you freeze. June didn't move. You're hiding something. We're all hiding something. Not from each other. Not if we're going to survive this winter together. Thomas let out a harsh laugh. Who said anything about surviving together? You'll be gone as soon as the snow clears. Will I? June's voice was sharp now. Because it seems to me you put out your daughter's cradle. You gave me food and warmth. You carried me through a blizzard when you could have left me to die. Those aren't the actions of a man who's planning to kick me out come spring. Thomas's jaw clenched. She was right, and he hated that she was right. You don't know anything about me, he said. I know you're in pain, June said quietly. I know you've lost people you loved. I know you're angry at the world and probably at God too. And I know that despite all of that, you still chose to help me. So yes, Thomas Hale, I think I know a few things about you. The silence stretched between them like a frozen river. One wrong step, and they'd both fall through. Finally, Thomas set down the axe. He flexed his bleeding hands and said, 5 years ago, a boy came to my ranch. He was young, maybe 14. Said he was hungry and needed work. My wife gave him food and let him sleep in the barn. June went very still. That night, Thomas continued, his voice flat. The boy knocked over a lantern. The barn caught fire. The wind carried embers to the house. He paused. My wife and daughter were inside. I was in town. By the time I got back, they were already gone. June's face drained of color. No. The boy ran. I never saw his face. But my wife kept a journal. She wrote his name down before she died. Thomas met June's eyes. Charlie Morrison. June stumbled backward like he'd struck her. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, but she didn't notice. You're lying. I wish I was. Charlie wouldn't, he didn't. June pressed both hands to her mouth. Oh God. He never told you. He never told me anything." June's voice cracked. "He just came home one night 3 years after Mama died, and he was different. Angry all the time, drinking. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares and wouldn't say why." Tears streamed down her face. "I thought it was because of Mama. I thought he was just grieving." "He was grieving," Thomas said quietly. "Just not for your mother." June sank to her knees in the snow. Sobs racked her body, harsh and broken. "I'm so sorry. Thomas, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Thomas stood there watching her fall apart and felt something twist in his chest. This girl, this woman, had nothing to do with what happened. She was as much a victim of Charlie Morrison as Thomas was, maybe more. He walked over and crouched down beside her. "Look at me." June shook her head, still sobbing. "June, look at me." She finally lifted her head. Her face was blotchy and red tears freezing on her cheeks. "You didn't do this," Thomas said. "Your brother did, and you are not responsible for his mistakes." "But I'm his blood." "So what? You think I'm going to blame a pregnant woman for something that happened 5 years ago when she wasn't even there?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm angry, June. I'm angrier than I know what to do with. But I'm not angry at you." June stared at him, disbelief written across her face. "How can you say that? How can you even stand to look at me? Because you're not him." Thomas reached out and picked up the fallen blanket, draping it back around her shoulders. "Now get up before you catch your death." He stood and offered his hand. June hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. Thomas pulled her to her feet and guided her back toward the cabin. Inside, he sat her by the fire and poured hot water from the kettle into a cup. He added some dried herbs, something Mary used to make for Emma when she couldn't sleep, and handed it to June. "Drink." June wrapped her hands around the cup, but didn't drink. She just stared into the fire, her face blank with shock. "I should leave," she said finally. "No." "Thomas." I said no. He sat down across from her. "You're 7 months pregnant, you've got nowhere to go, and the snow's not going to clear for another 2 months at least. You're staying." "Why?" June's voice broke. "After what my brother did to you, why would you let me stay?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because my wife asked me to forgive him. And I can't do that. Maybe I never will. But I can do this. I can make sure his sister doesn't die in the snow. I can make sure his niece or nephew gets born safe." He paused. "It's not forgiveness, but maybe it's a start." June's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Probably not, but you're getting it anyway." They sat in silence after that. The fire crackled. Outside, wind whistled through the trees. June eventually drank the tea, and some color came back to her face. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Thomas nodded. "Your daughter, Emma. What was she like?" Thomas's throat tightened. He hadn't talked about Emma in 5 years. Hadn't let himself remember her laugh or the way she'd climb into his lap and demand stories about the bears in the mountains. But now looking at June, looking at the baby she carried, he found the words coming easier than expected. "She was stubborn," he said. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Just like her mother. Would argue with me about everything. Whether the sky was blue or purple, whether bears really hibernated or just took long naps." He shook his head. "She was only 4 years old, but she acted like she knew everything." June smiled through her tears. "She sounds wonderful." "She was." Thomas's voice roughened. "She was the best thing I ever did." "I'm sure she knew you loved her." "I hope so." Thomas stood abruptly and moved to the window. "I hope she knew that." June set down her cup and joined him at the window. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. "My baby," June said softly, one hand on her belly. I don't even know if it's a boy or a girl. Don't know what I'll name them. Don't know if I can keep them safe. She looked at Thomas. But I know I'll love them, the way you loved Emma, the way you still love her. Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there, staring out at the snow, trying to reconcile the anger he'd carried for 5 years with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope that was starting to take root in his chest. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Thomas would wake before dawn, tend the fire, and head outside to chop wood or check his trap lines. June would wake later, make breakfast from whatever Thomas had left out, and spend her mornings mending his clothes or cleaning the cabin. They didn't talk much at first. The revelation about Charlie hung between them like a weight neither knew how to lift. But slowly, carefully, they learned to exist in the same space without the past crushing them. One morning, June found Thomas's shirt torn beyond repair. She held it up and said, "This is more whole than fabric." Thomas glanced over. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You'll freeze." June set it aside. "I can make you a new one if you have any extra cloth." "I don't." "Then I'll make do with what we have." June pulled out her sewing kit, a small tin box that had been her mother's, and got to work. Thomas watched her for a moment. Her fingers moved quickly, competently, stitching patches from old blankets onto the torn fabric. She hummed while she worked some tune he didn't recognize. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" he asked. "Mama taught me. Said a woman who couldn't mend was a woman who'd freeze come winter." June smiled sadly. She was practical like that. "What happened to her?" "Fever, 3 years ago." June's hands stilled. "We didn't have money for a doctor. By the time Charlie realized how bad it was too late." "I'm sorry." June shrugged. "Everyone's got losses, I suppose. Some people just carry them better than others." Thomas grunted. "You think I carry mine well. I think you carry them the only way you know how." June looked up at him. "Which is better than not carrying them at all." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he just went back to sharpening his knife. Later that afternoon, June stood up too quickly and gasped, pressing a hand to her side. Thomas was on his feet immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, just—" June winced. "The baby kicked. Hard." Thomas relaxed slightly. "That's normal." "You sound very confident for a man who probably hasn't been around many pregnant women." "My wife. I was there through the whole thing with Emma." Thomas hesitated. "Do you need to sit down?" "I'm fine." But June did sit, her face pale. "It's just strange, feeling her move, knowing there's a whole person in there waiting to come out." "Her," June smiled. "I think it's a girl. Don't ask me why. Just a feeling." Thomas nodded slowly. Then, before he could stop himself, he asked, "What will you name her?" June's expression softened. "I don't know yet. Something strong. Something that means she survived." She paused. "What would you have named another child if you'd had one?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "We wanted more, Mary and I. But after Emma there were complications. Doctor said it wasn't safe to try again." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. We had Emma. That was enough." Thomas stood and moved to the fireplace, unable to meet June's eyes. "That should have been enough." June watched him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You know what I think." "What?" "I think Emma would be glad you helped me. I think she'd want you to." Thomas's hands clenched on the mantel. "Don't." "Why not?" "It's true, isn't it? You didn't know her." "No, but I know you." June stood and walked over to him. "And I know that the man who carved that cradle, who kept it all these years, that man wouldn't want another child to die if he could prevent it." Thomas turned to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed. "You don't understand. Every time I look at you, I see what I lost. Every time that baby kicks, I remember Emma kicking in Mary's belly. And every time I think about helping you, I wonder if I'm betraying them." You're not, June said firmly. You're honoring them. You're doing what they would have wanted.
Jit.
How do you know? Because you read me your wife's journal entry. She asked you to forgive Charlie. That means she believed in second chances. She believed people could be more than their worst mistakes. June placed her hand on Thomas's arm. You helping me? That's you keeping her faith alive. Thomas stared at her. Something in his chest cracked open, and for the first time since the fire, he felt like he could breathe. I don't know if I can do this, he said hoarsely. Yes, you can, June said. You've been doing it for weeks now. Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he said, If you're going to stay through the winter, we need to set some rules. June nodded. All right. You don't go outside alone. The snow's deep and there are wolves. Agreed. You tell me immediately if something feels wrong with the baby. I will. And you stop apologizing for things you didn't do. Thomas's voice was rough, but not unkind. You're not your brother. Stop acting like you have to pay for his sins. June's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Thomas nodded curtly and turned away before she could see how much her words had affected him. That night, June woke to screaming. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and realized the screams were coming from Thomas. He was in his bed across the cabin, thrashing in his sleep, shouting words she couldn't understand. June threw off her blanket and hurried over. Thomas? Thomas, wake up. He didn't wake. His face was twisted in agony, sweat pouring down his temples despite the cold. June shook his shoulder harder. Thomas. His eyes flew open. For a second he didn't recognize her. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard enough to bruise. Thomas, it's me. It's June. Recognition flooded back into his eyes. He released her immediately and sat up, breathing hard. I'm sorry. I didn't. It's okay. June sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing her wrist. Nightmare. Thomas nodded, his face haunted. It's always the same. I'm running toward the house, but my legs won't move fast enough. I can hear them screaming, but I can't reach them. He pressed his palms against his eyes. 5 years, and it never stops. I get them too, June said quietly. Different nightmares, but the same feeling of helplessness. Thomas lowered his hands. What do you dream about? My brother selling me. Except in the dream, the men who buy me don't just want me for work. They want... She broke off, shuddering. It doesn't matter. It matters. Thomas's voice was hard. What they tried to do to you matters. June looked at him. You sound angry. I am angry. Not at you, he added quickly. At them. At Charlie. At every man who thinks a woman is something to be bought and sold. You're not like them. How do you know? Because you're sitting here asking me about my nightmares instead of telling me to deal with them alone. June managed a small smile. That's how I know. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Thomas said, When Emma had nightmares, Mary would sing to her. Some old lullaby her mother taught her. It always helped. Do you remember it? Bits and pieces. Will you sing it? Thomas looked startled. Now. Why not, unless you're too embarrassed? Thomas huffed. I'm not embarrassed. I just don't have much of a voice. I don't care what you sound like. Just sing. So Thomas did. His voice was rough and uncertain, stumbling over words he hadn't spoken in years. But June closed her eyes and listened, and for the first time since she'd fled into the snow, she felt something like peace. When the song ended, Thomas said, I should let you sleep. Wait. June caught his hand. Thank you. For this. For everything. Thomas looked down at their joined hands. June's were small and calloused from work. His were scarred and rough, but somehow they fit together. You're welcome, he said finally. June smiled and stood heading back to her makeshift bed by the fire. As she settled under the blankets, She heard Thomas lie back down, but neither of them slept for a long time after that. The next morning, Thomas woke to find June already up and making breakfast. She moved around the cabin with more confidence now, no longer asking permission before using his things. "Morning," she said when she noticed he was awake. "Morning." Thomas sat up and rubbed his face. "You didn't have to cook." "I wanted to. You've been doing everything around here. Least I can do is make you eggs that aren't burned." Thomas almost smiled. "My eggs aren't that bad. Thomas, last week you served me something that looked like leather." "That was one time." "It was 3 times." June handed him a plate. "Now eat before it gets cold." Thomas ate. The eggs were good, better than good. He hadn't had a decent meal in years. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "Mama. Same as the sewing." June sat down across from him with her own plate. She said a woman needed 3 skills to survive cooking, mending, and knowing when to run. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. June smiled sadly. "I miss her every day." Thomas nodded. He understood that kind of missing, the kind that never went away, just learned to live alongside you. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence. Then Thomas said, "I need to check the trap lines today. Should be back before dark." "Can I come with you?" Thomas frowned. "It's a long walk, and the snow's deep." "I'm pregnant, not made of glass." "June? Please, I've been cooped up in this cabin for weeks. I need to move, need to see something other than these 4 walls." Thomas studied her. She did look restless, like a wild animal kept too long in a cage, and he supposed it couldn't hurt, as long as he kept her close and didn't let her overexert herself. "Fine," he said. "But you do exactly what I say. No arguments." June's face lit up. "No arguments." "I mean it, June." "I know. I promise." She was already pulling on her boots, excitement radiating from her like heat from a flame. Thomas shook his head, wondering what he'd just agreed to. They set out an hour later, Thomas leading the way through the snow. June followed close behind, her breath coming in visible puffs. The cold bit at Thomas's face, but the sun was out and the sky was clear. It was a good day for walking. "Tell me about the traps," June said after a while. "What about them? How do they work? What are you catching?" Thomas explained as they walked, how he set snares for rabbits, deadfalls for larger game, how he checked them every few days to make sure nothing suffered longer than necessary. June listened intently, asking questions, genuinely interested. It had been years since Thomas had someone to talk to about these things. Years since anyone cared. They reached the first trap, empty. Thomas reset it and moved on. The second trap held a rabbit. Thomas dispatched it quickly, efficiently, and added it to the pack on his back. "Does it bother you?" June asked quietly. "Killing them," Thomas considered. "It used to. When I first moved up here, I couldn't stand it. But Mary said if I was going to eat meat, I needed to be willing to kill it myself. Anything else was cowardice." She sounds like she was very practical. She was. Too practical sometimes. She'd tell me when I was being foolish, when I was letting pride or anger make my decisions. Thomas's voice softened. "I needed that. Still do, I suppose." June touched his arm. "Maybe that's why I'm here." Thomas looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Maybe I'm here to tell you when you're being foolish. When you're letting grief make your decisions instead of sense." Thomas almost smiled. "You think you're that brave?" "I think I don't have much choice. Brave or not, I'm here. Might as well make myself useful." They continued walking. The day wore on. Thomas checked 4 more traps, 2 empty, one with a rabbit, 1 with a marten. June walked beside him the whole way, never complaining, even though he could tell she was tired. On the way back, the sun began to set. The temperature dropped sharply. Thomas glanced at June and saw her shivering despite the layers. "We need to hurry," he said. But just then, June stumbled. She caught herself on a tree trunk, breathing hard. "I'm fine," she said before Thomas could ask. "Just need a second." "You're exhausted. I shouldn't have brought you." "I'm glad you did." June straightened determination in her eyes. "I'll make it. Just give me a minute." Thomas waited, watching her carefully. She was strong, stronger than he'd given her credit for. But she was also 7 months pregnant and had been through hell. There was only so much the human body could take. "All right," June said finally. "I'm ready." They made it back to the cabin just as full dark fell. Thomas got June inside and sat her by the fire while he started heating water for tea. "Thank you," June said, "for taking me with you." "You're welcome. But next time speak up if you're getting tired." "I will." June smiled. "Promise." Thomas handed her the tea and sat down across from her. They stayed like that for a long time, just sitting in the warmth, listening to the fire crackle. And for the first time in 5 years, Thomas Hale didn't feel quite so alone. The weeks passed, and winter deepened its grip on the mountains. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls, until Thomas had to dig a path to the woodshed every morning. The cold was brutal, the kind that crept into your bones and made you wonder if you'd ever be warm again. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. The silence between Thomas and June was no longer heavy with unspoken grief. It had become comfortable, almost companionable. June's belly had grown larger, and she moved more slowly now, one hand always pressed to her lower back. Thomas found himself watching her more often than he meant to, making sure she didn't overexert herself, that she ate enough that she stayed warm. One morning he caught himself carving something by the fire while June mended a pair of his socks. He looked down and realized he'd been making a small wooden toy, a horse rough but recognizable. His hands had moved on their own muscle memory from years ago when he used to make toys for Emma. "That's beautiful," June said, noticing. Thomas almost threw it in the fire, but instead he set it down on the table. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. It's lovely." June picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You made toys for Emma, didn't you?" Thomas nodded, throat tight. "She was lucky to have you." "She wasn't lucky at all. She's dead." "That doesn't mean she wasn't loved while she was alive." June set the horse down gently. "Love doesn't disappear just because the person does." Thomas stared at the toy. "Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like. I can remember her laugh the way she'd run to me when I came home. But her voice—" He broke off. "It's fading." June reached across and took his hand. "Then tell me about her. Tell me everything you remember. Maybe if you say it out loud it won't fade anymore." So Thomas did. He told June about Emma's first steps, how she'd fallen and gotten right back up, stubborn even then. He told her about the time Emma had found a baby bird and insisted they keep it, even though Thomas knew it wouldn't survive. He told her about bedtime stories and morning cuddles, and the way Emma used to steal bites of his breakfast when she thought he wasn't looking. June listened to all of it, tears streaming down her face, and when Thomas finally stopped talking, she said, "She sounds perfect." She was, and I failed her. "No." June's voice was fierce. "You loved her. That's not failure. Failure would have been not loving her at all." Thomas looked at June, really looked at her. When had she become so important to him? When had her presence shifted from obligation to something he actually needed? "You're going to be a good mother," he said quietly. June's breath caught. "You think so?" "I know so. You've got that same stubborn streak Emma had. That's what children need. Someone who won't give up on them." June smiled through her tears. "I'm scared, Thomas. What if I can't protect her? What if something happens and I'm not strong enough?" "Then you do what every parent does. You get back up and try again." Thomas squeezed her hand. "And you won't be alone. I'll be here." "You mean that?" Thomas realized he did. Somewhere along the way, June and her unborn baby had stopped being reminders of what he'd lost and started being something new. something that might even be called hope. "Yeah," he said. "I mean it." June stood and wrapped her arms around him. Thomas froze for a second, then slowly, carefully hugged her back. She was warm and solid and alive, and for the first time in 5 years, Thomas let himself believe that maybe life wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning again. They pulled apart, and June wiped her eyes. "I should start dinner." "Let me help." "You don't have to." "I want to." They worked together in the small kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that came from weeks of shared space. June chopped vegetables while Thomas tended the stew pot. At one point, their shoulders brushed, and neither of them pulled away. "Can I ask you something?" June said after a while. "Depends on what it is." "What would Mary think of this, of me being here?" Thomas considered. "She'd probably tell me to stop brooding and make myself useful. She never had patience for self-pity." June laughed softly. "I think I would have liked her." "She would have liked you too. You remind me of her, actually. That same fire. That same refusal to quit even when quitting makes sense." "Is that a compliment?" "The highest one I know how to give." June smiled and went back to chopping. But Thomas noticed the way her hand shook slightly, the way she kept blinking back tears. He wanted to say something more, something that would take away the fear he saw in her eyes. But he didn't know how, so instead, he just stayed close, letting his presence say what his words couldn't. That night after dinner, June suddenly gasped and pressed both hands to her belly. Thomas was on his feet instantly. "What's wrong?" "She's moving, a lot." June's eyes were wide. "Here, feel." She grabbed Thomas's hand and placed it on her belly. For a second, he felt nothing. Then a kick, strong and insistent, right against his palm. Thomas's breath caught. He remembered this. Remembered the first time he'd felt Emma kick, the wonder and terror of knowing there was a whole person growing inside Mary's body. "She's strong," he said, his voice rough. "She's going to be a fighter." June covered his hand with hers. "Just like her Uncle Thomas." Thomas looked up sharply. "I'm not." "You are. Whether you want to be or not." June's eyes were fierce. "You saved my life. You're keeping us safe. That makes you family." Thomas didn't know what to say. Family. He hadn't had family in 5 years. Hadn't wanted it. But now, with June's hand warm over his and the baby kicking against his palm, he realized he did want it. Desperately. "All right," he said finally. "Family." June beamed at him, and Thomas felt something crack open in his chest that he'd thought was sealed forever. They stayed like that until the baby settled. Then June yawned and announced she was going to bed. Thomas banked the fire and settled into his own bed across the cabin. But sleep didn't come easily. He kept thinking about June's words, about being family, about the baby who would be here in a few weeks, about what it meant to start over. Outside wind howled through the trees. Thomas listened to it and tried not to think about the fact that winter was only half over, that there was still so much that could go wrong. He finally drifted off near dawn, and when he woke a few hours later, June was already up making breakfast. She smiled at him, and Thomas realized with a jolt that he'd smiled back. When had that become natural? When had the weight on his chest gotten light enough to allow for smiles? "Sleep well?" June asked. "Well enough. The baby kept me up half the night doing somersaults. I think she's training for something." Thomas almost laughed. "Sounds like Emma. She used to kick Mary so hard we could see it through her nightgown." "Did you talk to her, to Emma, I mean, before she was born?" "All the time. Mary said it was silly, but I'd put my hand on her belly and tell Emma stories about the mountains, about the animals, about all the things we'd do together when she got here." Thomas's voice softened. "I wanted her to know my voice, to know she was wanted." "That's not silly. That's beautiful." June set a plate in front of him. "Will you talk to my baby?" Tell her stories like you did with Emma." Thomas looked up, surprised. "You want me to?" "I do. I want her to know your voice too. I want her to know she's got more than just me. That she's got—" June's voice caught. "That she's got someone who'll protect her. Someone strong." Thomas's throat tightened. "I don't know if I'm strong anymore. You're the strongest person I know." June sat down across from him. "You lost everything, and you're still here. Still getting up every morning. Still chopping wood and checking traps and keeping this cabin warm. That's strength, Thomas. Or stubbornness. Same thing sometimes." They ate breakfast together, and afterward Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He placed his hand on June's belly and started talking to the baby. "Hey there, little one. My name's Thomas. I'm a friend of your mama's. She's pretty stubborn, in case you haven't noticed. Gets that from her own mama, I expect. You're going to have a lot to live up to." He paused. "Your mama's the bravest person I've ever met. She ran through a blizzard to keep you safe, fought off men twice her size, survived things that would have broken most people. So you make sure you listen to her, you hear? She knows what she's talking about." June was crying by the time he finished. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas pulled his hand back, suddenly self-conscious. "It's nothing. It's everything." They sat in silence for a moment. Then June said, "I've been thinking about names. Yeah. If it's a girl, I want to name her Hope. Because that's what she is. Hope for a better life. Hope that things can get better even when they seem impossible." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's a good name. And if it's a boy, I was thinking—" June hesitated. "I was thinking maybe Thomas. If you'd be okay with that." Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "June, you don't have to. I want to. You've given us everything. A home. Safety. A chance at a future. Naming my child after you is the least I can do. What about your father? Or your mother's father?" June's face darkened. "My father left before I was born. And my mother's father—" She shook her head. "Let's just say he wasn't a good man. You're the only man I'd want my child named after." Thomas didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded. June smiled and went back to her sewing. Thomas stood and grabbed his coat. "I need to check the traps." "Be careful." "Always am." But as Thomas stepped outside into the bitter cold, he realized he wasn't being careful at all. He was letting himself care again, letting himself hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing of all. The trap line was productive that day. Thomas caught 2 rabbits and a fox, enough to keep them fed for several days. He was on his way back when he saw the tracks. Wolf tracks, fresh, leading toward the cabin. Thomas's blood went cold. He broke into a run, the pack bouncing on his back. Wolves didn't usually come this close to human settlements unless they were desperate, and desperate wolves were dangerous. He burst through the cabin door to find June standing at the window staring out with wide eyes. "There's something out there," she said. "I heard howling." Thomas set down his pack and grabbed his rifle. "How long ago?" 5 minutes, maybe less." June's hand was pressed to her belly, protective. "What is it?" "Wolves. Pack of them from the looks of the tracks." Thomas checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded. "They're probably just passing through, but we need to be ready in case they're not." "What do we do?" "You stay inside. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anything unless you hear my voice." "Thomas, you can't go out there alone." "I'm not asking permission." Thomas's voice was hard. "Those wolves smell blood. They'll come for the livestock. And if they come for the livestock, they'll come for us. I need to drive them off before that happens." June grabbed his arm. "Please be careful." Thomas looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, the way her free hand cradled her belly. And he realized with startling clarity that he had something to lose again, something worth fighting for. "I will," he said. "I promise." He stepped outside, and June locked the door behind him. The cold bit at his face, but Thomas barely felt it. He was focused on the tree line, on the shadows moving between the pines. The howling came again, closer this time. Thomas counted at least 3 distinct voices, maybe 4. A hunting pack. He raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed through the valley, and the howling stopped abruptly. Thomas waited. 1 minute. 2. Then he saw them 4 wolves, lean and hungry, slinking out of the trees. Their eyes gleamed in the fading light fixed on the cabin. On June. "Get out of here!" Thomas shouted. He fired another shot, this time closer to the lead wolf. It yelped and jumped back, but didn't run. The wolves circled, trying to flank him. Thomas kept the rifle trained on the alpha, a massive gray male with scars across his muzzle. The wolf that had survived more fights than it should have. The kind of wolf that didn't scare easily. "Come on," Thomas muttered. "Just leave. You don't want this fight." But the alpha kept coming low and cautious, testing Thomas's resolve. Thomas fired again. The bullet hit the snow inches from the alpha's paws. The wolf snarled but still didn't retreat. Behind Thomas, he heard June shout something through the door. He didn't turn. Couldn't afford to. The wolves were too close now, too focused. The alpha lunged. Thomas didn't think. He just fired. The shot caught the wolf mid-leap, and it crashed into the snow dead before it hit the ground. The other wolves scattered, howling in rage and fear. Thomas fired twice more, driving them back into the trees. When the last one disappeared, he stood there for a long moment, rifle still raised, listening. Nothing. Just wind and his own harsh breathing. Thomas lowered the rifle and turned back to the cabin. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from adrenaline and the realization of how close he'd come to failing. If he'd been a second slower, if his aim had been off. The door flew open, and June ran out, throwing her arms around him. "You're okay. Oh God, you're okay." Thomas held her tight, one hand still gripping the rifle. "I told you to stay inside." "I don't care. I needed to make sure you were alive." June pulled back, her face streaked with tears. "Don't ever do that again. Don't ever make me think I'm going to lose you." Thomas stared at her. "Lose you." The words hit him harder than they should have. Because somewhere along the way, without either of them quite realizing it, they'd become essential to each other. "I'm fine," he said roughly. "Just a few wolves." "Just a few wolves," June repeated, half laughing, half crying. "You could have been killed. But I wasn't. And neither were you. That's all that matters." June pressed her forehead against his chest. "I was so scared." "So was I." Thomas let himself hold her, let himself feel the warmth of another person who cared whether he lived or died. "But we're okay. We're both okay." They stood like that until the cold drove them inside. Thomas dragged the dead wolf away from the cabin, no sense letting the smell attract more predators, and came back to find June heating water for tea. "That was incredibly brave," she said. "Or incredibly stupid. I'm not sure which." "Probably both." Thomas sat down heavily, exhaustion hitting him all at once. "They won't come back, not after that." "How can you be sure?" "Pack won't risk another fight after losing their alpha. They'll find easier prey." Thomas accepted the tea June handed him. "We're safe." June sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You keep saying that. We're safe. Like it's a promise." "It is a promise. As long as I'm alive, nothing's going to hurt you or that baby." June's eyes filled with tears again. Why do you care so much?" Thomas set down his cup and looked at her. Really looked at her. "Because you're family, and family protects each other." June kissed him then. It wasn't passionate or desperate, just soft and grateful and real. When she pulled back, Thomas's heart was hammering in his chest. "I'm sorry," June said quickly. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize." Thomas's voice was rough. "Just give me a minute to think." June nodded and stood moving back to the fire. Thomas sat there, his mind racing. He cared about June, more than cared. But this couldn't happen. Shouldn't happen. She was Charlie Morrison's sister, the man who'd killed his family. How could Thomas let himself feel anything for her beyond basic human decency? But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. He already felt more. Had felt it for weeks now. Maybe longer. "June," he said finally. She turned her face carefully neutral. "You don't have to say anything. I understand." "No, you don't." Thomas stood and crossed to her. "You think I'm going to reject you because of your brother, because of what happened 5 years ago. Aren't you?" "I should. God knows I should." Thomas reached out and cupped her face in his scarred hands. "But I can't. Because when I look at you, I don't see Charlie Morrison. I see a woman who's braver than anyone I've ever met. A woman who ran through a blizzard to protect her child. A woman who makes me want to be better than I am." June's breath hitched. "Thomas, let me finish." His thumb brushed away a tear on her cheek. "Mary asked me to forgive your brother. I can't do that. But I can do this. I can let myself care about you. I can let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there's still life worth living after everything I've lost." "You mean that?" "Every word." June kissed him again, and this time Thomas kissed back. It was gentle and careful, and carried the weight of all the grief they'd both survived. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "This doesn't solve everything," he said quietly. "I'm still broken, still angry, still grieving." "So am I. But maybe we can be broken together." June took his hand and placed it on her belly. "Maybe we can build something new." The baby kicked against Thomas's palm, strong and insistent, a reminder that life kept going, kept fighting, even when the world tried to snuff it out. "All right," Thomas said. "Something new." They held each other by the fire, neither speaking, just being. Outside, the wind howled, and the wolves mourned their dead alpha. But inside the cabin, two broken people began the slow, painful work of healing. And for the first time in 5 years, Thomas Hale believed it was possible. The days after the wolves were different. Thomas and June moved around each other with a new awareness. Touches lingering a moment longer than necessary, eyes meeting across the cabin and holding. They didn't talk about the kiss or what it meant. Words felt inadequate for something that had shifted so fundamentally between them. June's belly had grown so large now that she struggled to stand without help. Thomas found himself constantly at her side, offering his arm when she needed to walk, adjusting pillows behind her back when she sat, making sure she ate enough even when she insisted she was full. "You're going to make yourself sick fussing over me," June said one morning as Thomas handed her a second helping of porridge. "Then I'll fuss over you while you're sick too." "Thomas Hale, I'm capable of feeding myself." "Didn't say you weren't, but the baby needs food and you're not eating enough." June sighed but took the bowl. "You're impossible." "So I've been told." Thomas turned back to the stove, hiding a smile. This felt right. Natural. Like they'd been doing this dance for years instead of months. But underneath the domesticity, Thomas felt something else. A tension he couldn't name. He'd catch himself staring out the window at the tree line, watching for movement. At night, he slept lighter than usual, one hand always near his rifle. "You're worried about something," June said later that afternoon. She was sitting by the fire mending one of his shirts. "I can tell." Thomas looked up from sharpening his knife. "What makes you say that? You've checked that window 17 times in the last hour, and you keep touching the rifle like you're making sure it's still there." Thomas set down the knife. There was no point lying to her. "The wolves came too close. That means something drove them down from higher elevation. Could be a harder winter up there. Could be lack of game. Either way, if they're desperate enough to approach a human settlement." Other predators might too. Maybe, or maybe I'm just being paranoid. June set down her mending and looked at him directly. Your instincts kept you alive up here for 5 years alone. I trust them. If you think something's wrong, something's probably wrong. Thomas nodded slowly. That was one of the things he'd come to value about June. She didn't dismiss his concerns or tell him he was overreacting. She listened and trusted his judgment. I want you to do something for me, he said. What? If anything happens, if anyone comes here who isn't me, I want you to hide. There's a space under the floorboards in the corner. Barely big enough for one person, but you'd fit. June's face went pale. Thomas, you're scaring me. Good. Being scared keeps you alert. Thomas crossed to the corner and pulled up a loose board revealing a shallow depression beneath. I dug this after Mary died. Thought I might need a place to hide valuables. Never used it. But it's there if you need it. Why would I need it? Thomas replaced the board and turned to face her. Your brother sold you once. What's to stop him from trying again, or sending those men back to collect what they paid for? June's hand flew to her belly, protective. They don't know where I am. They couldn't possibly. They know you ran into these woods. They know it's winter, and options are limited. If they're determined enough, they'll search every cabin within a day's ride. Thomas came and knelt beside her chair. I'm not trying to frighten you for no reason, but I need to know you'll be smart if trouble comes. That you'll hide and stay hidden no matter what you hear. What am I going to hear? Thomas's jaw tightened. Nothing good. June stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scars on his cheek. You'd fight for us. For me and the baby. To my last breath. Then I'll hide. But only if you promise me something. What? That you'll survive. That you won't do something noble and stupid that gets you killed. June's voice cracked. I can't lose you, Thomas. I've already lost too much. Thomas caught her hand and pressed it against his heart. I'm not planning on dying. But if something does happen... Don't. Please don't finish that sentence. Thomas pulled her close instead, holding her as tightly as he dared with her belly between them. She smelled like wood smoke and the lavender soap she made from herbs she'd found in Mary's old stores. She smelled like home. Nothing's going to happen, he said against her hair. I'm just being careful. But even as he said it, Thomas felt that tension coiling tighter in his gut. Something was coming. He could feel it the way animals felt earthquakes before they struck. That night, Thomas barely slept. He lay in his bed across the cabin listening to June's soft breathing, watching shadows move across the walls. Around 3 a.m, he gave up and went outside. The air was bitterly cold, sharp enough to hurt his lungs. The moon was nearly full, turning the snow-covered clearing into something ghostly and beautiful. Thomas walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for tracks for any sign that something had come close while they slept. Nothing. Just his own footprints from yesterday and the drag marks where he'd hauled the dead wolf away. He was about to go back inside when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Distant but coming closer. Thomas's blood turned to ice. He ran back to the cabin and burst through the door. June, wake up. June sat up instantly, alert. What is it? Riders, coming fast. Thomas grabbed his rifle and checked the load. Get in the hiding spot. Now. June didn't argue. She threw off her blankets and moved as quickly as her bulk would allow to the corner. Thomas helped her lower herself into the shallow depression, ignoring her sharp intake of breath as her belly pressed against the earth. It's too small, she gasped. Thomas, I don't fit. You have to. Thomas positioned her on her side, curling her body around her belly. It was tight, nearly impossible, but she managed. He handed her a knife. Don't come out until I say it's safe. And if I don't make it, stop. June. I said stop. You're coming back. You have to. Thomas wanted to promise her that. Wanted to believe it himself. Instead, he just pressed his hand against her cheek one last time. I love you. I need you to know that. June's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas." He replaced the floorboard before she could finish. Then he moved to the door, positioning himself where he could see anyone who approached. The hoofbeats grew louder. Thomas counted 3 horses, maybe 4. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. He heard men's voices, low and rough. Then footsteps. Coming closer. Thomas's hands tightened on the rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to fire first, ask questions later. But he forced himself to wait. To see what they wanted. The door rattled. Someone was trying the latch. "Cabin's occupied," Thomas called out. "Move along." The rattling stopped. A man's voice answered. "We're looking for someone. A woman. Pregnant. She ran into these woods about 2 months back." Thomas's blood turned cold, but he kept his voice steady. "Haven't seen anyone. Just me up here. You mind if we come in and look around?" "Yeah, I mind. This is private property. You can check the next cabin over 10 miles east." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Thing is, we paid good money for that woman, and we intend to collect what's ours. Nothing here belongs to you. Now get off my land before I put a bullet in you." The response was a gunshot. The bullet tore through the door inches from Thomas's head. He dropped and rolled, coming up with his rifle aimed at the door. "That how you want to play this?" Thomas called out. "Fine, but I've got more ammunition than you've got patience." Another shot. This one hit the window, shattering glass across the floor. Thomas fired back, aiming through the broken window at where he estimated the shooter was standing. A man screamed. Good. That meant he'd hit something. "You son of a bitch!" someone shouted. "You shot Lyle." "Lyle should have stayed on his horse," Thomas replied. He reloaded quickly, keeping low. "Next one's going to hit something more vital. Last chance to ride away." "We ain't leaving without that girl." "Then I guess you're not leaving at all." The door exploded inward. 2 men rushed through, guns raised. Thomas shot the first one in the chest. He went down hard. The second one got off a shot that grazed Thomas's shoulder, but Thomas's return fire caught him in the throat. Silence. Thomas stayed low, breathing hard, waiting to see if there were more. "Jesus Christ," a voice said from outside. "He killed them both." "So we kill him," another voice responded. "Burn the cabin down if we have to. The girl's in there somewhere. She's got to be." Thomas's heart hammered. They weren't going to leave. And if they started a fire... He heard scraping sounds. They were gathering kindling. Thomas moved to the window and fired 3 rapid shots. One of them hit. He heard a yell of pain, but the others scattered into the darkness. "You want to burn down this cabin, you're going to have to do it over my dead body," Thomas shouted. "That can be arranged." A flaming branch arced through the broken window and landed on the floor near the table. Thomas stomped it out immediately, but 2 more followed. He got one, but the second landed in the pile of kindling by the fireplace and caught. Smoke began to fill the cabin. Thomas's mind raced. He couldn't let the fire spread. But he also couldn't leave the door unguarded. If he turned his back, they'd rush in and find June. He grabbed a water bucket and threw it on the flames. The fire hissed and died down, but didn't go out completely. More burning branches came through the window. Thomas batted them away, but his eyes were watering from the smoke, and his shoulder was bleeding badly. Underneath the floorboards, June would be choking on smoke. Trapped. Helpless. Thomas made his decision. He walked to the door and kicked it open. 3 men stood in the clearing, backlit by moonlight. The one in the middle was reloading his pistol. The other 2 had rifles already aimed. "All right," Thomas said. "You want to fight? Let's fight. But we do it out here away from the cabin, man to man." The middle one laughed. "You're in no position to make demands." "Aren't I? You burn that cabin down, you'll never find the girl. She could be buried in the snow for all you know. Could be miles from here. But if you fight me fair and win, I'll tell you where she is." "You're lying." "Maybe. But are you willing to risk it?" Thomas stepped fully outside, rifle in one hand. "Come on, let's see what you're made of." The three men exchanged glances. Then the middle one shrugged and holstered his pistol. "All right, old man. You want to die quick, that's fine by me." He charged. Thomas waited until he was close, then swung the rifle like a club. It connected with the man's jaw, and he went down hard. The other two opened fire. Thomas dove behind the woodpile, feeling bullets slam into the logs inches from his head. He came up firing, catching one man in the leg. The man screamed and fell. The last one standing was younger, maybe early 20s, with fear written all over his face. His hands shook as he tried to reload. "Drop it," Thomas said, aiming at the kid's chest. "Drop it and ride out of here. Tell whoever sent you that the woman's gone, that she died in the snow." "I can't do that." "Yes, you can. You're not like them." Thomas gestured at the bodies around them. "You don't want to die for someone else's greed, so drop the gun and go." The kid stared at him, then slowly he lowered his weapon. "If my boss finds out, he won't, because you're going to tell him I killed you all, that you barely escaped with your life." Thomas kept his rifle trained on him. "Can you do that?" The kid nodded jerkily. "Then get on your horse and ride, and if I ever see you again, I won't be so generous." The kid ran to his horse and mounted. He looked back once, then kicked the animal into a gallop and disappeared into the darkness. Thomas waited until he was sure the kid was gone. Then he dropped to his knees, exhaustion and pain crashing over him. His shoulder was on fire. His hands were shaking, and smoke was still pouring from the cabin. The cabin. June. Thomas forced himself up and stumbled inside. The fire had spread to the curtains, now flames licking up toward the roof. Thomas grabbed another bucket and doused them, then another. The smoke was so thick he could barely see. "June!" he shouted. "It's safe! Come out!" No response. Thomas's heart stopped. He ran to the corner and tore up the floorboard. June was unconscious, her face pale, her chest barely moving. "No! No! No! No!" Thomas hauled her out of the hiding space, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. He carried her outside into the cold, clean air and laid her in the snow. "Breathe," he commanded, pressing his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was there, weak but steady. "Come on, June. Breathe." He tilted her head back and blew air into her lungs the way he'd seen a doctor do once. Once, twice, 3 times. June gasped and coughed, her eyes flying open. She sucked in air desperately, her whole body shaking. "That's it," Thomas said, relief flooding through him so powerfully he felt dizzy. "That's it. Keep breathing." June grabbed onto him, coughing and crying at the same time. "The baby, Thomas, I can't feel her." Thomas placed his hand on her belly and waited. For a terrifying moment, nothing. Then a kick, strong and angry. "She's there," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "She's okay. You're both okay." June sobbed against his chest, while Thomas held her, both of them kneeling in the snow, while smoke poured from the cabin and bodies lay cooling around them. "They found us," June choked out. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter. They're gone now. Most of them dead, one of them running scared. They won't be back." "You're bleeding." Thomas looked down at his shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but it was still seeping blood. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're hurt, and the cabin's on fire, and—" June tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. "Thomas, everything's falling apart." No, it's not." Thomas scooped her up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "The cabin's still standing. We're both alive. The baby's safe. That's what matters." He carried her back inside. The fire had mostly died down, leaving scorch marks and smoke damage, but nothing structural. Thomas set June in a chair away from the smoke and went to check the damage. It could have been worse. Much worse. The curtains were destroyed, the table was scorched, and there were bullet holes in 2 walls. But the roof was intact, and the fire hadn't spread to the support beams. Thomas grabbed clean cloth and pressed it against his shoulder. The bleeding was slowing. He'd survive. June was crying silently, her hands pressed against her belly. Thomas knelt beside her. "Talk to me. I almost got you killed. If you died because of me, I didn't die. And you didn't get me killed. Your brother did this. Those men did this, not you." "It's the same thing." "It's not." Thomas took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. You are not responsible for other people's evil. You are not your brother. You are not those men. You're just a woman trying to protect her child. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let you carry guilt for things you didn't do." June stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to stop feeling like it's my fault." "Then don't stop. Feel it and keep going anyway. That's what survivors do." Thomas pulled her into his arms. "We survived tonight. That's enough." They stayed like that until June's tears dried up and her breathing steadied. Then Thomas cleaned and bandaged his shoulder while June swept up the broken glass. Neither spoke much. There was too much to process, too much fear still coursing through them. But when they finally settled down for what remained of the night, Thomas in a chair with his rifle across his lap. June on her makeshift bed with blankets piled high. June reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for protecting us." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Always will, long as I'm breathing." "I love you too," June said softly. "I didn't get to say it before, but I do. I love you, Thomas Hale." Thomas looked at her, this brave, broken woman, who'd run through a blizzard, who'd survived things that should have destroyed her, who'd somehow made him believe in second chances. "I know," he said. "I know." Outside, dawn was breaking. The bodies in the clearing would need to be dealt with. The cabin would need repairs. There was still so much that could go wrong. But for now, in this moment, they were alive. They were together. And that was enough. The morning came cold and gray. Thomas spent the first hours after sunrise dragging the bodies away from the cabin and burying them in shallow graves he hacked out of the frozen ground. His shoulder throbbed with every shovelful of earth, but he didn't stop. June needed to feel safe, and she couldn't do that with dead men lying in her yard. When he finally came back inside, June had hot water waiting and clean bandages. She unwrapped his shoulder without a word, her face pale but determined. "It's not as bad as it looks," Thomas said. "It looks terrible." June cleaned the wound carefully, her hands steady, despite the tremor he could see running through her. "You could have died last night. But I didn't." "You could have." June's voice broke. "And then what would I have done? How would I have survived without you?" Thomas caught her hand, stilling it. "You would have done what you've always done. You would have fought. You would have protected that baby. You would have survived because that's who you are." "I don't feel very strong right now." Strength isn't about feeling strong. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're terrified. Thomas looked at her directly. "You hid in that space, even though you were scared. You trusted me to handle it. That took more courage than anything I did." June finished bandaging him in silence. Then she said, "We can't stay here." Thomas had been thinking the same thing. "No, we can't. Those men might have told others where we are, and even if they didn't, word will spread about what happened, about the bodies." June pressed both hands to her belly. "We need to go somewhere safer, somewhere no one will look for us. There's a healer, woman named Ruth, lives about 15 miles south near the river. She's the one who helped Mary when—" Thomas stopped, his throat tight. "She's the only person I trust. If we can make it there, she'll keep us safe until the baby comes." "Can I travel?" "In my condition." Thomas looked at her belly, at how low the baby had dropped. "You're close, very close. But if we move now, we might have a few days before labor starts. If we wait, we risk another attack." June nodded slowly. "Then we go. Today." They spent the next hour preparing. Thomas packed food, blankets, medical supplies. June gathered what few possessions she had: her mother's sewing kit, the dress Thomas had mended for her, the small wooden horse he'd carved. She held that horse for a long moment, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "For the baby," she said quietly. "So she'll have something that came from here, from this place where we found each other." Thomas's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her they'd come back, that this cabin would always be here. But he knew better. This place was tainted now. Too many ghosts, too much blood. They'd never be able to live here peacefully again. "We should go," he said instead. The journey was brutal. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a crust that broke under their weight with every step. June struggled, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other gripping Thomas's arm. They had to stop every few hundred yards to let her catch her breath. "I'm slowing us down," June gasped after the third stop. "We're not in a race." Thomas helped her sit on a fallen log. "Rest as long as you need. What if they come back? What if they followed us?" "They won't." Thomas scanned the tree line anyway, rifle ready. "And even if they do, I'll handle it." June looked at him with such trust, such absolute faith, that Thomas felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. This woman and her child were depending on him. He couldn't fail them the way he'd failed Mary and Emma. He wouldn't. They made it another mile before June cried out and doubled over. Thomas caught her before she fell. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Pain," June gasped. "Sharp, like something's tearing." Thomas's blood went cold. "The baby? I don't know. Maybe. It's too soon, isn't it? I still have a few weeks." Another pain hit, and June's knees buckled. Thomas lowered her to the ground as gently as he could, his mind racing. They were still 10 miles from Ruth's cabin. 10 miles through snow and cold with June in labor. They weren't going to make it. "All right," Thomas said, forcing calm into his voice. "All right, we need shelter. There's an old hunting shelter about half a mile west. Can you walk?" June nodded, teeth clenched against the pain. "I can try." Thomas helped her up, and they moved as quickly as June's condition allowed. Every 50 yards, she had to stop breathing through contractions that were coming closer together now. Thomas counted the time between them. 5 minutes, 4, 3. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not. The shelter appeared through the trees, barely more than 3 walls and a partial roof, but it would block the wind. Thomas got June inside and made her as comfortable as he could with the blankets from his pack. "I need to start a fire," he said. "We'll need hot water. Can you manage for a few minutes?" June grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't leave me." "I'm not leaving. I'm right outside, I promise." Thomas brushed hair back from her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." He built the fire just outside the shelter, using deadfall and kindling he'd packed. The flames caught quickly, and he set snow melting in his cooking pot. Inside the shelter, June was breathing hard, her face twisted with pain. Thomas had seen birth before, had been there when Emma was born, had held Mary's hand through the whole thing. But this was different. This was in the middle of nowhere, with no doctor, no midwife, no help coming. Just him and June, and a baby that was determined to be born in the worst possible circumstances. "Thomas," June called out. "Something's happening." Thomas abandoned the fire and knelt beside her. "Talk to me." "I need to push. I can feel it. I need to push." "Not yet. Wait until—" "I can't wait." June's scream tore through the air. "The baby's coming now." Thomas had never moved faster in his life. He positioned himself where he could see, where he could help, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "All right," he said, forcing his voice steady. "All right. When the next contraction comes, you push. You hear me? You push as hard as you can." June nodded, sweat pouring down her face despite the cold. When the contraction hit, she bore down with a guttural sound that was more animal than human. Thomas saw the baby's head, dark hair matted with blood and fluid. "That's it," he said. That's good. One more. One more push. June pushed again, and the baby's head emerged fully. Thomas supported it with shaking hands, marveling at how small it was, how impossibly fragile. Shoulders next, he said. One more big push, June. You can do this. I can't. Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. Now push. June pushed with everything she had left. The baby slid into Thomas's hands in a rush of blood and water and life. For a horrible second, it didn't move. Didn't breathe. Thomas's world stopped. Then the baby gasped and let out a wail that echoed through the forest like a declaration of war. Thomas almost sobbed with relief. He cleared the baby's mouth and nose, wrapped her in the cleanest blanket he had, and placed her on June's chest. "It's a girl," he said, his voice shaking. "You have a daughter." June was crying and laughing at the same time, her hands cradling the baby's tiny head. "She's perfect." Thomas looked at her. "She's perfect." Thomas looked, and she was. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that worked beautifully, judging by the volume of her cries. She had June's dark hair and a face that was red and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful. "What are you going to name her?" Thomas asked. June didn't hesitate. "Hope. Her name is Hope." Thomas felt something break open in his chest. Hope. After everything they'd survived, everything they'd lost, June was naming her daughter Hope. "It's a good name," he said roughly. "Will you hold her while I—" June gestured weakly at the mess of afterbirth and blood. Thomas took the baby carefully, terrified he'd drop her or hurt her somehow. But Hope settled against his chest like she belonged there, her cries quieting to small hiccups. He looked down at her tiny face and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Purpose. He cleaned June up as best he could, then helped her get comfortable. The shelter was crude, but the fire was strong, and they had enough blankets to keep warm. June took Hope back and tried to feed her. After a few false starts, the baby latched on and nursed hungrily. "We did it," June said, wonder in her voice. "We actually did it." "You did it. I just caught her." "Don't sell yourself short. You delivered my baby in the middle of a forest in winter. That's not nothing." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, they wouldn't have. June reached out and took his hand. "You saved our lives, both of us, more than once. I don't know how I'll ever repay that." "You don't need to repay anything. You're family. That's what family does." June's eyes filled with tears. "Family." "Yeah, family." They stayed in the shelter for 3 days. Thomas hunted and kept the fire going while June recovered and learned how to be a mother. He watched her with hope and felt his heart, which he'd thought was permanently broken, start to piece itself back together. On the morning of the 4th day, June announced she was strong enough to travel. Thomas disagreed, but June was adamant. "Hope needs a real roof over her head. And I need to know we're truly safe. Ruth's cabin is still the best option." Thomas couldn't argue with that logic. They packed carefully, Thomas carrying most of the gear, while June carried Hope wrapped against her chest. The journey that would normally take 4 hours took them all day, but they made it. Ruth's cabin sat in a small clearing by the river. It was larger than Thomas's place, with a garden plot and a small barn. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He knocked on the door. It opened immediately, revealing a woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Thomas Hale," Ruth said. "Didn't think I'd see you again in this lifetime." "Hello, Ruth." Ruth's eyes moved from Thomas to June, to the bundle in June's arms. Her expression softened. "Come in, all of you. You look half frozen." The cabin was warm and clean, and smelled like herbs and bread. Ruth settled them by the fire and made tea while Thomas explained everything that had happened. Ruth listened without interrupting, her face grave. "Those men won't come here," she said finally. "I've got a reputation in these parts. People know not to cross me. I don't want to put you in danger, June said. Ruth waved a dismissive hand. Danger and I are old friends. Besides, no one's taking a baby from my house, not while I'm breathing. She moved closer to peer at Hope. She's beautiful, healthy. Strong lungs and a good appetite, Thomas said. Then she'll do fine. Ruth looked at June. You need rest, proper rest. I've got a spare room you can use for as long as you need. June's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. We don't have money to pay you. Don't want money, just want to see you and that baby safe. Ruth turned to Thomas. You'll stay too. Thomas hesitated. If you have room. I have room. And more than that, I have a barn that needs repair and firewood that needs chopping. You can work off your keep. Thomas nodded. It was more than fair. It was generous. They settled into Ruth's cabin, and for the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself to relax. The danger wasn't completely gone, it never would be, but here they had backup. Here they had someone who understood how to survive in this harsh country. Spring came slowly, melting the snow inch by inch. Thomas spent his days working on Ruth's property, repairing fences and chopping wood. June spent hers with Hope, learning how to be a mother with Ruth's patient guidance. One evening, Thomas came in from working to find June sitting by the fire with Hope in her arms. The baby was awake, staring up at her mother with wide, curious eyes. She smiled today, June said when she saw Thomas. A real smile, not just gas. Look. Thomas crossed over and looked down at Hope. The baby stared at him for a moment, then her face split into a gummy smile that made his heart turn over. She knows you, June said softly. She knows you're her protector. Thomas reached out and Hope grabbed his finger, her grip surprisingly strong. Hey there, little Hope, you're getting big. She is, growing more every day. June looked up at Thomas. Ruth says by summer, we can think about finding our own place. Somewhere permanent. You want that, your own place? I want a home. For Hope. For us. June paused. If you want that too. Thomas looked at her, at this woman who'd survived so much, who'd given him a reason to keep living when he'd thought there was nothing left. He thought about Mary and Emma, about the family he'd lost. And he realized that loving them didn't mean he couldn't love again. Yeah, he said. I want that. June smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. Good. Because Hope needs a father. And I need... She stopped suddenly, shy. What do you need? You. I need you, Thomas Hale. Is that allowed? Thomas set down the firewood he'd been carrying and knelt beside her chair. He took her free hand, the one not holding Hope, and looked her in the eye. June Morrison, you and your daughter saved my life just as much as I saved yours, maybe more. So yes, it's allowed. It's more than allowed. He kissed her, then gentle and careful with Hope between them. When they pulled apart, June was crying and laughing at the same time. We're going to be okay, she said. All three of us. We're going to be okay. And looking at her, at the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, Thomas believed it. For the first time since the fire that had taken everything, he believed that life could be good again. That happiness wasn't something that only happened to other people. That summer, with Ruth's help, they built a small cabin of their own on a piece of land near the river. It wasn't fancy, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Thomas carved Hope's name into a beam over the door. Right below it, he carved Emma's name too, because both girls deserved to be remembered. Both had taught him what it meant to love. On the day they moved in, June stood in the doorway holding Hope, looking at their new home with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said, for this, for everything. Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around both of them. Nothing to thank me for. This is where we were always meant to end up. That night, after Hope was asleep in the cradle Thomas had built June, and Thomas sat by their own fire in their own cabin. Outside, night birds called and the river rushed past. Inside, warmth and peace, and the promise of tomorrow. "Do you ever think about Charlie?" June asked quietly. Thomas considered. "Sometimes. Not as much as I used to." "Do you hate him still?" "Hate's exhausting, and I don't have energy for it anymore." Thomas looked at June. "I'm not saying I forgive him. I don't know if I ever will. But I'm not going to let what he did poison the rest of my life. Mary wouldn't have wanted that." June nodded. "I think about him too. Wonder where he is. If he's still alive. If he ever thinks about what he did to us." "Does it matter?" "No," June said after a moment. "No, I suppose it doesn't. We survived despite him. We're here and we're happy, and we have hope. That's all that matters." "That's all that matters," Thomas agreed. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then June said, "Tell me about Emma. I want Hope to know she had a sister, even if they never met." So Thomas told her. He told her about Emma's laugh and her stubbornness and the way she'd loved stories about bears. He told her about the toys he'd carved and the songs Mary used to sing. He told her everything he could remember, speaking the memories into life so they wouldn't fade. And June listened, holding his hand, understanding that this was how you honored the dead. Not by forgetting them. Not by pretending they never existed. But by remembering them with love, and letting that love make you better. When Thomas finally stopped talking, his voice was hoarse, but his heart felt lighter. June stood and pulled him up. "Come to bed," she said. "Tomorrow's a new day. We have a garden to plant, and a baby to raise, and a life to build." "And we'll build it," Thomas said. "Together." They checked on Hope one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling steadily, then went to their own bed. Thomas wrapped his arms around June and listened to her breathing slow as she drifted off to sleep. He lay awake a while longer, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. About June running through a blizzard with nothing but determination and hope. About the night he'd found her half frozen in the snow. About wolves and gunfights, and a baby born in a crude shelter with only Thomas's scarred hands to deliver her. They'd survived. Against every odd, against every reason to give up, they'd survived. And more than that, they'd found each other. Two broken people who'd somehow fit their jagged pieces together and made something whole. Thomas closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years settle over him like a warm blanket. Peace. The next morning, Thomas woke to Hope's hungry cries and June's soft laughter. He opened his eyes to find early morning light streaming through the window, turning everything golden. June was sitting up in bed, nursing Hope, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Good morning," she said when she saw he was awake. "Morning." Thomas stretched, feeling the pull of old scars and new muscles from months of hard work. "She hungry?" "Always." June smiled down at Hope. "I think she's going to be tall like you, already eating like she's got hollow legs." Thomas got up and started the fire, then put coffee on to boil. The morning routine felt right, natural, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. "Ruth's coming by later," June said. "She wants to bring vegetables from her garden. Says we need to eat more greens." "Ruth thinks everyone needs to eat more greens." "Well, she's probably right." June shifted Hope to her other side. "Thomas." "Yeah. I'm happy. I don't think I've ever said that out loud before, but I am. I'm happy here with you." Thomas turned from the fire and looked at his family, because that's what they were now, a family, and felt his throat go tight. "Me too. Didn't think I'd ever say that again, but here we are." "Here we are," June echoed. And that was the truth of it. They were here. They'd survived the worst that life could throw at them, and they were still standing, still fighting, still loving. Hope finished nursing, and June handed her to Thomas. He held the baby carefully, marveling at how much she'd grown in just a few months. She looked up at him with eyes that were starting to shift from baby blue to something darker. June's eyes, maybe. Or maybe something entirely her own. "You're going to have a good life," Thomas told her quietly. "Your mama and I are going to make sure of it. You're going to grow up safe and loved and strong. You're going to know that you can survive anything, because you come from survivors. Hope made a small sound and grabbed his thumb. Thomas smiled. Outside, the sun continued to rise, warming the valley and melting the last of winter's snow. The river sang its endless song and birds called to each other in the trees. Life went on as it always did, indifferent to human suffering and human joy alike. But inside the cabin, 3 people who'd been broken found themselves whole. A man who'd lost everything learned to love again. A woman who'd been sold like property learned she was worth more than gold. And a baby girl who'd been born in the worst circumstances possible grew up knowing she was wanted, loved, and protected. Some wounds aren't healed by words, but by warmth, by someone who keeps the fire lit when the world goes cold. Thomas had kept that fire burning, and in return, June and Hope had given him something he thought he'd lost forever. A reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason to believe that even from ashes, a home could rise.